Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fredrik Eriksson, and I am very pleased to welcome you all to this afternoon seminar we are going to have here today. First of all, let me apologize for this event starting later than it should. It's actually my fault entirely because I had a computer crash. Finally, it's been resolved, so we can now get going. I'm very pleased to say that we are going to have a true expert event talking about sanctions, EU sanctions against Russia, and what perspectives that are important to us as we now look at the sixth package and the previous packages of sanctions that have been taken before that, and as we begin to think about what else that can be done on the sanction side in order to improve the conditions for Russia to change its current war in Ukraine and to come to a position where there are opportunities for peaceful relations in the future. I think you all know the background and the context for this conversation. Some people have been surprised that there has been faster and more comprehensive sanctions than expected against Russia. There, of course, is a history behind why many people were pessimistic about the notion that Europe and others were going to move swiftly and comprehensively with sanctions against Russia. Now we've seen a development since late February where Europe, together with America and others, gradually have increased the significance of the sanctions and imposed stronger economic costs on Russia for its current behavior. However, there are still huge gaps in the sanctions program, and these gaps are sometimes perfectly obvious. We've been discussing them for quite some time, what they are about: gas and oil, hydrocarbons. We also know that there are a few other problems related to the sanctions as well. We may have problems with sanctions circumvention. We may have other problems as well that we need to go into to discuss. But I think the important thing for the discussion in Europe right now, as we begin to think about what more can be done from the European side to increase the economic costs and the political costs on Russia for its behavior, is of course to go through what has happened in the past and look at how we practically can move on with new sanctions that will also begin to hit some of the sectors where trade and economic exchange remains pretty strong. I am very pleased to welcome three true expert speakers that are joining us this afternoon, and they're all joining us from Ukraine. We have Oleksiy Makeyev, who is ambassador and special envoy on sanctions in Ukraine. We have Alex Rodnyansky, who is in normal times professor of economics at the University of Cambridge, but is now advising the Ukrainian government on economic issues. And we have Natalia Shapoval, who is the chairman of the Kiev Institute and a member also of the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions, which Alex also is. A group that has been also actively participating with Stanford University and Michael McFaul over there, have published a range of extraordinarily good analysis and insights on sanctions, both in terms of what we know about them and their economic consequences, and what needs more to be done in order to improve or to increase the economic costs of Russia's behavior. We are going to listen to them, kicking off this conversation with introductions, and then we're going to open up for discussions and questions and answers. So, without much further ado, I am going to hand over to our Ukrainian colleagues, and I think Oleksiy, you want to start first?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Frederick, for inviting me to speak to your audience and to you. Well, let me give a short introduction about the importance of sanctions. I'm dealing with sanctions for about 8 years, and the notion of sanctions is completely different comparing to what we had 4 months ago. With the beginning of the full-scale Russian aggressor, sanctions are not anymore a tool, a diplomatic tool, which aims at changing behavior of a bad actor, be it state or private person. Sanctions is now a punitive measure. And I would say that sanctions are diplomatic weapon. And this diplomatic weapon must be applied in a smart way and very precise. And this is exactly what we are trying to do with our partners and with the Sanctions Coalition, to use this sanctions weapon in a smart way. I have a simple definition of what smart sanctions are. Smart sanctions are 3 things: smart coordination, smart targeting, and smart communication. And I tell you a bit more about it. So with smart coordination, we all know that sanctions can be effective only if they are taken by a number of countries. The more countries are participating in sanctioning Russia in this case, the more efficient sanctions are. And we managed to gather a bigger coalition of like-minded nations. Over 40 countries of the European Union and overseas are coordinating this job in order to make sure Russia stops this genocidal war against Ukraine. Second is smart targeting, and we apply a principle which has been wisely for a long time promoted by one of my colleagues, former sanctions coordinator Dan Fried, calling "follow the money." So it is important to sanctions those individuals and those companies who have their assets abroad, and those sanctions would inflict pain on them and seriously damage their abilities in the economy of Russian Federation. And third is smart communication. Talking about sanctions, so everybody is now talking sanctions. Some question the sanctions efficiency, and we will talk about a bit later. But it is important to talk directly to the constituencies and to the voters. And this is my call on all the governments of the Sanctions Coalition. Be honest with your voters. Why you apply sanctions? Why you use this weapon? Tell them that this weapon is most efficient weapon, which is, well, probably one step before going into the war. And to make this weapon really efficient, one must not only convince the other countries to follow, but to explain in an honest way to the population the price of such sanctions. By the way, one of the very dangerous notions which is now spreading in the Western societies is that sanctions inflict damage to the economies of those countries who are imposing sanctions. Let me correct it from the very beginning. No, this is not sanctions inflict damage on your economies. This is a Russian war inflicts damage on your economies. And sanctions, once again, is the best and the last peaceful resort that the governments can apply in terms of diplomatic tools. So this is how sanctions changed, and I would say that they work. From what we see, and I suppose that both Alexandra and Natalia will tell a bit more about it, we see the fall of Russian economy projected in 2022 about 10%, inflation rates going up. To some estimates, Russian economy would need 10 years to recover to the level of 2022. Oil and gas production is falling, but is this enough? I would say no, and we will maybe come back to the issue: what can Europe do more about sanctions in my further intervention and whatever this question arises during our discussion. I would stop here, Frederick.
All right, thank you very much, Alexei. Just one question to you. So when you looked at the sixth package that came from Europe just a couple of weeks ago, were there any surprises in there for you?
Well, if you coordinate, and Ukraine, as I said, Ukraine is sitting at the table with the sanctions coalition, and we talk to sanctions coordinator on a weekly basis, and we have really 24/7 touch with most capitals. So no surprises there. There was a bit disappointment that it took that long to agree on the sixth European package, and of course there was a disappointment with the language of the oil-related sanctions. We have seen in previous packages that all the exemptions and derogations make our position weaker than expected, and this is why we came back to all the capitals, insisting that energy sanctions, further energy sanctions on coal, oil, and gas must be included in the next packages.
All right, very good. So, Alexander, let's move over to you. And I mean, you've been heavily involved in the International Research Working Group here, also working with the Jeremy McFall group that I alluded to in the past. I'm particularly interested to hear about energy sanctions and basically taking on from where Alexei just ended, which is, of course, that Europe has had some problems with including energy in these packages. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people in Europe would like to do it, but they fear that the economic costs of it would be too high, and they fear that they need to gradually include energy into sanctions package over a long period of time. So can we start there, perhaps? If you could just sort of provide your analysis on these issues and what you think about the possibilities of including energy much faster and much more comprehensively into sanctions package.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks for including me on the panel, for having us here. It's a privilege to speak with my colleagues. So what I will say is I'll start by echoing what Alexei just mentioned, which is that sanctions are absolutely vital. And this whole notion that somehow they're too costly and not the concern of the European Union in particular, and that there's still this reflex of hoping to negotiate some deal with the Russian Federation, I think is, besides being deeply immoral, is also just completely counterproductive, delusional, and irresponsible. I mean, the fact is there is a full-scale war in Europe and we need to respond. And just closing your eyes and thinking that this will pass and somehow Ukraine has to strike a deal, it's just not an option. Now, you've mentioned the sanctions group. I'll say 2 words about that. We have been working hard with the Yermak-McFaul sanctions group on giving out proposal, writing policy briefs about the types of sanctions that should be imposed, that could be imposed, that have been imposed, and the types of steps that could be taken. Remember, sanctions, broadly defined, come in 2 forms. One form is a broad economic sectoral type of sanction, and that's obviously key in this particular case because we want to make sure that Russia doesn't have the financing to continue its war efforts, and that's where these sanctions matter. But then there is a second type of sanction, which is a targeted individual type of sanctions regime. And again, that's key, but more important in the medium to long run, to make sure that we dismantle the oligarchy as a form of governance, because the oligarchy has led to what we are seeing now. It has led to this war. It has contributed to the fact that we're living with a neighbor that is nuclearly armed, but doesn't have the most basic institutions, democratic institutions, to prevent this sort of thing from happening. And the reason it doesn't have those institutions is because there's a whole class of oligarchs and Russian elites that have been undermining these institutions for years. And bribing courts, bribing law enforcement, disowning or basically taking away the businesses from disloyal oligarchs or oligarchs that haven't been convenient to the regime. And we have to make sure we understand who we're dealing with. We can't let these people be part of any system going forward, right? So that's why it's important to make sure that we don't only seize their assets, but that we make them pay and that we dismantle them and disintegrate them from any form of governance going forward, and that we monitor their activities very carefully. So that's what I will say at the outset. I'll go into the details of energy sanctions. Now, that's obviously the elephant in the room. Why? Because Russia's budget, depending on the year, is 50 to 60% reliant, directly and indirectly taken together, on energy revenues. That is the export of oil, gas, and coal. Now, coal is the smallest part, and it has already been sanctioned starting from August, so we can leave that out. But at current gas and oil prices, Russia is still earning incredible amounts of revenue, despite the fact that there is a promise of sanctions, and we are welcoming the 6th sanction package, and the fact that there is now a promise to reduce oil imports from Russia into the EU by 90% by the end of 2022. We welcome that step, but I can't not point out the fact that when that decision was taken, oil prices actually went up. And in the short run, in the very short run, Russia actually benefits from that increase in prices more than it loses from the fact that volumes or quantities are going to go down sometime later down the stretch. So again, we have to keep track of what's happening, and we have to make sure that Russia is deprived of the funds to conduct the war already now. So I think we're failing on that element, and we're seeing the war continue and escalate. But there's this question of whether Europe can do it or not. So remember, in terms of the remaining big component, which is gas, we know that gas is hard to substitute. We accept that and respect that. But at the same time, Europe can start developing its own gas infrastructure. We know that LNG terminals could be increased. We know that there's an existing network of LNG terminals, even though Germany doesn't have a single one yet, which could be increased in terms of the capacity going in, right? There is supplies from the Middle East that could come. There's supplies from the United States and still some capacity to increase production from there that could come through these terminals. There's also the whole issue of a green transition and the acceleration of a green transition, which was already part of the plan before, but now is really the time to do that. And as I mentioned, there is even the possibility of developing shale gas in Europe, and Groningen, things like that come to mind when we speak about this. But most importantly, what I would like to say here, and this is relevant for the 7th sanction package, which we're still waiting for, and which I hope will include some measures with regard to gas, is that there's things in between. There's an intermediate solution that could already be taken now, respecting the fact that gas is hard to substitute away from, and that Europe has made itself extremely reliant on imports of Russian gas. Okay, well, there is still the option of an import tariff, which has not really been discussed or considered. There is an option of a price cap, which again, we've proposed in many of those policy briefs, and not just there. which could be international and not just individual import tariffs depending on the country and the region. It could be an internationally accepted price cap. And again, that hasn't been discussed, hasn't been really considered. There is the whole idea of using escrow accounts. And in other words, making sure, so Russia would still be formally getting payments, but it would only receive the monies once it withdraws from Ukraine, or perhaps only for humanitarian purposes and not for the purposes of whatever they desire to spend their money on, which is war. So there's all these intermediate solutions, compromise solutions, if you want, which aren't really considered. And when we talk about it to the highest people in power in Europe, they almost don't seem to understand what we mean sometimes. So that is, deeply frustrating and somewhat concerning. And I think it's time to really consider those options right now, because they would still allow Europe to import Russian gas if it so desires and is so dependent upon it. But at the same time, it would deprive Russia of the surplus revenue, the profits that it's generating. And remember, there's even people who dispute the fact until now in Europe and in countries like Germany that there is a relationship between oil and gas revenues in Russia and the financing of war. There's people at the highest level of political decision-making that dispute this link. I mean, look at what happened last week or 2 weeks ago. Russia was promising its soldiers the threefold salary increase for going to Ukraine. They were promising compensation record amounts, which they never did before. So they are using monetary stimuli as they never did ever in any of their conduct of war, even in previous conflicts. So that clearly tells you that budget constraints and financial matters are key to this whole war effort, besides the obvious other reasons. If we were to take away 50% of Russia's budget revenues, which a full embargo would do on oil of its energy exports, we would put Russia in such a dire fiscal situation that they would really have to decide whether they keep paying pensions or whether they think that killing people in Ukraine is more important to them. It would destabilize the system from within, and even just by that token, pull out resources from the war. So that's where we are. We are still convincing people in Europe that somehow this matters and somehow it's in their interest. And I think that's just deeply appalling. And we need to take action right now. It's been more than 100 days, 111, I think, to be precise, ever since the start of the war. And I think it's really time to act decisively.
All right. Thank you very much, Alexander. We are going to come back to many of the issues that you raised here in your introduction with more specific ideas for what can be done. But first, let me go to Natalia and talk a little bit more about sanctions and sanctions packages and what's important with them. I know you've also been involved in this work. You've been focusing on sort of the trade, financial, logistics part of sanctions, including when they connect with the energy sector. So, Natalia, over to you.
Yes, good evening. So I'm very sorry to have some interruption in internet and you might not see my video. When
That's
I can,
fine.
I will switch it again. Yeah, indeed. So we worked with Alexei and Alexander on the energy sanctions and the general action plan. So indeed, it's right now highlighted by my colleagues how important is energy for the Russian economy. And indeed, these are huge amounts of money coming every day, basically. Estimates of almost $1 billion coming to Russia daily. So what we observe now is that while European countries, they are switching from Russian oil and start buying less Russian gas, Russia already reorients their supply flows to India, for example, China and Turkey. For example, India, who was buying almost zero at the beginning of winter, now is forecasted to buy around 1 billion barrels a day in June. So, of course, the scope, how much Russia can reorient is questionable, but we are totally sure that there will be a huge percentage of what they are supplying now to Europe. And I think the interesting observation here is that commodities in general, not just oil, is becoming leverage to blackmail the whole world. So first, Russia is trying to increase prices on commodities, and it's happening not just with oil, but it's also happening with agri-food products. It's happening with the fertilizers, and they push the prices up, and then they come to countries like India or Armenia or Georgia or Turkey, and trying to negotiate some trade or relations, and by selling these commodities at a discount, they are gaining all kinds of benefits for themselves, like a possibility to use these jurisdictions to import dual-use goods, for example, or any other high technology imports that is banned. So that's a part of very sophisticated strategy, which implies that not only separately trade sanctions or financial sanctions should be imposed, but we should increasingly think how to interlink financial sanctions with trade sanctions with logistic sanctions. For example, on the financial side, we already start thinking about specific licensing regimes for a Gazprom Bank, for example. And I think this discussion on the infrastructure, how to control Russian trade and control the transactions with third countries would be evolving, because they increasingly use these instruments to create kind of colonies from other countries who are not among Ukrainian partners right now, and to leverage that. So as you correctly mentioned, another point I want to make is this insurance and logistics. So that's a huge part of discussion. And even though in the sixth package, we see already that insurance will be prohibited for the European countries. And even UK mentioned that they will partner on that. But we haven't seen, for example, from UK, very specific legal acts on that. So in numbers, almost all Russian oil, or 80%, is exported by the sea. So, and 70% inside of this number is EU, UK, and Norway companies. Greece alone is 43% of this market. And this logistics is not banned for now. And of course, while the fixed package doesn't mention specifically blend oil, and we haven't seen any specific regulatory act that would talk about blend, it means that a very large part of the market is still there. So, and just a few more mentions about insurance. Again, Great Britain, Norway, and Sweden alone is almost all market, 97% of insurance for Russian oil market. So when this rule will come into force, of course, Russia will be very much more limited from obtaining their incomes from oil sales. So that's a short overview, right? So it's all, I want to highlight that it's all very much interlinked, And in our work on sanctions, we should take into account and also interlink how we can use all the customs infrastructure, all the financial infrastructure in order to control the compliance to the measures that we impose in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Let me also say that we're going to come back to some of the very important and specific issues that you mentioned there, or perhaps we can even start with one of them. And if I can take this question also to you, Alexei. So we know that in order for sanctions to be not just effective, but also to be efficient, meaning that we think that we can reach the target we have for them, we need to have a pretty dense network of sanctions that go into many different instruments, many different sectors, many different policy issues. There is sort of a coherence issue, which is important, that also Natalia alluded to now in what she said. Looking at where Europe stands right now, and of course acknowledging the fact that many of the problems that we're facing are not problems that can be controlled by Europe, decisions taken by other governments about importing gas or oil from Russia as a consequence of new market opportunities that arise when some countries are sanctioning that trade. It's unfortunate, but not something which, or at least something which is difficult to do anything about for Europe. But looking more at it from a broader point of view, are there any obvious issues that we are missed? Is there something we need to be a lot more careful and focused at when we take sanctions packages forward? Are there sort of obvious gaps which leads to a high degree of inefficiency in the sanctions?
Well, Frederick, actually, there are three most important elements in on our table of sanctions coordinators and the governments of the sanctions coalition. First is further strengthening of sectoral sanctions, and mostly we are talking about further sanctions in the financial sphere, further trade restrictions, and of course energy, which has been discussed today. Second element is personal sanctions, and we suggested as government of Ukraine, we took the ideas of the Yermak-Makfol group, and we suggested to the sanctions coalition some ideas on sequencing and smart targeting of those individuals among oligarchs, high-ranking civil servants, members of the boards of the state-owned enterprises, governors, etc., etc. So personal sanctions are very important. And third element is sanction circumvention. And this is where we need to look into the data available to the governments from open source investigations, intelligence data, financial and banking compliance systems to stop Russians using different countries, mostly from Eurasian Union, from Gulf, in circumventing sanctions. And this is exactly what we've been pushing this week and next week when preparing for the G7 summit next week for the European Council meeting next week. This sanction circumvention is what we need to push and to stop Russians from using those loopholes.
Yeah, indeed. Coming back to something which both you, Alexei, and Alex mentioned in your introduction. So I mean, I think the question here is how shall we look at the sanctions? And even if it may not be practical consequences of what I'm going to ask right now, I think it's an important contextual point. So, I mean, the underlying thesis with sanctions, as you started out to say, Alexei, is that you try to change the behavior of another party, and as you were speaking about yourself, it may be a tall order in this respect, sort of thinking that there are, at least in terms of the normal look at the sanctions programs, that you gradually increase the tightness and the consequence of it in order to raise the cost, and therefore you're going to get a change behavior at the end of the day. For me, I think the moral part of it is far more important, and it's what also you went into, Alexander, to say that the more we continue importing high volumes of nowadays gas and energy, the more we're going to finance a war, and the more we're going to make it far easier for a government to avoid the hard decisions they have to make about, as you said, either paying pensions to your elderly people or raising salaries for people that are going to go and ravage another country. And if we take that step a little bit further, I suppose what it means, and looking at the type of challenges we have going forward now, or the type of ambitions or that we should have going forward with, including gas or sort of the energy sector in a much more comprehensive way, we're basically talking about changes that will be permanent, right? We're not talking about something that, in the assumption that Russia was going to change its behavior, we will go back to something which existed previously. I think the underlying experiences of many Europeans as well is that we can never return to this type of dependency that we had on a regime with murderous instincts, and we want to avoid as much as possible to fuel that type of regime even more than that. And then I think we're into different territory, aren't we? We're talking about not sort of a traditional sanctions perspective things, but rather about trying to rearrange markets and exchange patterns in a way which is going to have permanent consequences. And in that respect, I suppose it's something of an experience that Ukraine must have done itself over the years. I mean, looking at the period from especially from 2014 onwards, with realization about living close to a neighbor with an intention about yourself which is highly problematic, or it's dangerous for you. You must have faced in or gone through a period when you've gradually taken down your intensities in exchange with Russia in order to avoid being dependent on a country that ultimately may start to invade you. So how's that process been? What can we learn from it when we look at it from Europe right now in terms of moving on with a change of policy that is going to reduce not just our money, the money that is being sent to Russia, but also our dependence on them?
Okay, so yes, I think you mentioned very correctly some very deep issues here that relate to this whole relationship between Europe and Russia and the civilized world, for that matter. And I agree with you. So these changes should be permanent in many respects. And one of the biggest, or one of the colossal misconceptions from before, was that somehow you could deal with an autocratic regime of that nature and not compromise on your own value system, or even on the functioning of your own democracy and economic system. And what we see right now is the result of that misconception. So, and going back to the sanctions, the fact that Europe will turn away from Russia's energy imports permanently once this is done, and that's what we've heard even the politicians in Europe say, in Germany in particular. They keep promising that in the medium run they are planning a transition away from Russia's energy imports permanently. And the fact that, on the other hand, we also have a sanctions regime on individuals, which hopefully will be long lasting, is exactly testimony to that this is the ultimate optimal response to these policy failures from before. Because if you let these people and these elites infiltrate your own system, your own democracies, what you get is the distortions that we've been witnessing. And not just the war in Ukraine, but you also get polarization within Europe. You get financing of extreme parties on the left, on the right, with the ultimate objective of, pulling out and fragmenting the political system so far that there is almost no common ground for any type of compromise on any of the most basic issues, and therefore undermining the whole idea of democracy and taking over. Essentially, all of these were belligerent steps. You've had the Russian elites planting their money in the European banking system, in Western banking systems, never ever adhering to the actual value system and the rules of the game, manipulating, deceiving, lying about all of their activities. These are not US type entrepreneurs that have made it to the top through talent, hard work, and grit. These are corrupt elites that made it to the top through nepotism and anything but fair play, right? And so ignoring all of these issues, which many years ago I was already talking about, and people thought I was crazy, and ignoring this and thinking that these perceptions are somehow misplaced leads to what we see right now. So at the very least, people can wake up to these calls for prudence at this point. And yes, we do have to, so going back to your question of sanctions and whether they should be permanent, I believe they should be permanent because right now that's the only tool that we really have to correct for all these deviations and distortions. But ultimately, we should think about maybe we need new policy frameworks, maybe we need new legislation in dealing with regimes like Russia, with belligerent, aggressive, corrupt, criminal and authoritarian regimes that don't just exist in some bubble, but seek to undermine Western democracies because guess what? If you can't be strong yourself, and obviously these regimes cannot be strong fundamentally in terms of their economies, in terms of how they function, they don't provide the foundation for sustainable growth, right? But they do want to survive and they do want to win in this combat against democracies. So if they can't be strong themselves, what do? They try to weaken their enemies. And that's what's dangerous. They try to polarize, they try to destroy from within. And it's time to recognize this. Because again, I'll give you an example. I speak to our Italian colleagues, and some of our Italian colleagues in the politics, in media, they still refuse to believe that there is any Russian interference in their country. They think it's all about free speech. Well, as long as Europe thinks this is about free speech, you're going to see more polarization, more undermining of democracies, and more warfare in Europe. So I think, yes, all of this is intricately linked. All of these things are closely interrelated, whether it's personal sanctions and corrupt elites, whether it's decisions at the very top that have led to warfare and one country invading another, and whether it's the financing of extremist parties and just the whole system of corruption and illegal wealth and so on and so forth.
Yeah, indeed. May I pick up something else you said, Alexander, in your introduction? So you were speaking about a couple of intermediary things that you have proposed to European governments, but the reactions haven't been forthcoming, if we put it diplomatically. You were mentioning, for instance, using an escrow account. You were talking about price caps. So when you look at these potential intermediary steps, what's most important of them? What do you think they could achieve if we started to introduce them now? What's your best case for them?
Yeah, so I think what we should do is introduce a high tariff or a price cap on imports of Russian gas right now if we can't introduce an embargo. There's various studies, people have looked at this carefully, and I've seen various scientific and practical studies on this issue. They range from, so the optimal tariff that should be introduced ranges somewhere within, from 30 to 50%. So you could pick the middle 40% or something in that range. So there is, again, just to say there is serious studies on these already and some elasticities and estimates that have been done. So that would make sure that, Russia can still export its gas and Europe can import it, but it would have to basically decrease its own price before the tariff and therefore we would decrease the amount of profits that they're generating from selling this gas. We could do this tomorrow. That would not lead to a collapse in Europe's or Germany's chemical industries, for example, as is often feared, and therefore cause some ripple effects through the economy. By the way, there is even serious scientific economic studies on what would happen if gas were to be, stopped. Imports of Russian gas would stop tomorrow. And those studies don't reach catastrophic conclusions when it comes to the economy. Yes, there is some cost, but it doesn't have to be that bad. It could be somewhere within the range of 200, 500 euros per head for the first year, and that's it, because afterwards you would have a adjustment that would then diminish these costs, and essentially they would only be short-lived. But what I'm saying is you wouldn't even have to do that because there's political resistance. You could just introduce a tariff or a price cap. So a tariff of 40%. That would be a substantial tariff on gas, and it would cripple Russia's ability to finance the war immediately. So I think that's what's missing, and that's what should be done.
An important thing in that as well, I think, when I think about especially sort of putting a tariff in and also using the escrow account is also, we need to keep up the pace with the more structural energy systems reforms that are underlying the European plans right now, with either building new LNG terminals, accelerating programs with building land-based wind power. It will take time. My fear is that sort of the longer the war runs and the more complacent European politicians are going to become and prioritizing these issues less. So having tariffs, escrow accounts, starting to phase them in right now, I think is also going to exacerbate the pressure on European politicians to come up with these substituting forces more quickly than they otherwise would be. Natalia, you went into it, and then Alexei also referred to it again, of the importance with sanctions circumvention. You referred to that there may have been sort of sanctioned products that end up in other territories, could be Asia, the Middle East, or elsewhere, and then they might find their way into Europe again. What do we know about this? I mean, I've been struggling to find a good literature, a good analysis on potential sanction circumvention so far. There are anecdotes out there, but do we know anything more about this? How widespread is it? How big is the problem? In what sectors does it tend to occur, etc.?
Okay, if I may start, and I believe Alexei has a lot on that too. So I think important to distinguish here that the problem is not only circumvention in the sense that violation of the sanction, but also the narrow scope of current sanctions. So if we look at any kind of trade sanction, including oil sanctions, they would suggest that in general, you cannot import something from Russia. But then if you still have a contract by this time, or if you need it urgently, or it can be connected to humanitarian need or something else, then in principle, you can buy. And we don't know the scale of that, but we know from reading the regulation that there are multiple ways to officially still buy and sell Russian products that are under sanctions. Second, what we know about violation is, I think, very illustrative is to look into history here, because even when we talk about Iran and 40 years of all kind of back and forth with them, there are multiple studies suggesting that they were able to buy and sell, to trade in weapons despite the sanctions. So that's a big bunch of literature suggesting that sometimes that you cannot ban anything. And to the best of my knowledge, there was no systemic effort to close any of those loopholes of which we already knew from other countries. So all that is still there. some insights that we have by monitoring Russian media and daily analysis of different websites, social media from Russia, and talking to people is that there seems to be a process of establishing companies in Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, OOE, Emirates, and something of that is already actually in the media. It's just not very systemic. And as long as we know that there is one case of a scheme, it means that there are many cases, right? So I believe that Russia exploring all of that, and I see that it is their long-term strategy, and there will be a trend. And in several months, we will see more and more talks about how these countries are supporting them. And given that it is strategically rational for them, there is no reason why it's not gonna be happening. And my most concern is, of course, imports by Russia, dual-use items, and various military products. That's the biggest thing. And again, just one more point here, which is probably a less concern generally. This is the parallel import scheme, which basically allows them to steal products of any international company, including pretty high technology products that can be then turned into something like resembling weapon. So that's more far-fetched, but still there is no explicit rules that would ban Russia to work with non-partner countries, but not with G7, not with EU, but the rest of the world, and to buy out from Africa the tanks that they sold them some time ago, etc. So whenever, my suggestion is that whenever we know that there is a scheme, we should consider that it is being used and try to close it, because of course we will never have a perfect evidence on how the black markets work. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A couple of questions that come from people that are watching us on different platforms. If I start with you, if I may, Alexei. So there is one question here about Russia's economic warfare against the rest of the world now, as it is denying the release of Ukrainian grains to be exported to other countries in the world. Are there any economic tools that the West, other countries can use in order to put pressure on Russia to at least make sure that Ukrainian grain exports can leave the harbors and get to the customers?
Well, we started moving out of the sanction scope, and of course this blockade of Ukrainian ports is a challenge for world food security. And once again, Russians are stealing Ukrainian grain. Russians are stealing Ukrainian steel. Russians trying to sell those goods all around the world. And Ukrainian diplomats practically are running ahead of those ships and tankers to different countries, urging them not to buy it. And we've been kind of successful in that. But still, Russia opened a black market on Ukrainian grain. Our most important message to the countries which are suffering and will be suffering is that actually do not call on Ukrainians to do something about it. Call on Russians to stop blockading and to stop this war, because shortage on grain and food will be not because of sanctions, but because of the Russian war. And once again, we are out of the sanction scope, there are some other economic tools, and there is a diplomacy. But the world has figured out that whatever you discuss and negotiate with Russia, you cannot really rely on Russia, and all the agreements with Russia are not worth the paper they are written on.
And coming back to you, let's say, which the same question that I asked Natalia. So how do we deal with, and you mentioned this yourself, sort of the importance of sanctions circumvention, sometimes sanctions violations even. So we have one issue which is around openness to information, transparency in the issue. And I think this is also alludes to a point that you were making now, which is that one thing which is important to do is not just that you, but also others are front-footed in making sure that the grains that Russia has stolen, that is not going to create sort of a black market for itself where it can sell these grains. And that is also about its information, its education, it's increasing transparency in different type of markets around the world to ensure that the consequences on Russia is going to be strongly felt. And I suppose it's the same thing also with sanctions circumvention, is something we also learned from previous sanctions packages throughout history, which is that a lot of things can achieve by just releasing information and making sure that people are aware that they are buying stuff which is coming from countries or companies that are being sanctioned. What more can we do? What should we focus on? Do you have sort of experiences that you've made which can be sort of more generically understood and help us to sort of lead a work which is about making sure that sanctions are being followed and that they will have their intended effects?
Well, the issue of sanctions circumvention, as also Natalia mentioned, is both identifying trends, but it is rather a one case-by-case basis. So if we see something happening, we start using the multilateral diplomacy, so talking to sanctions coordinators and just identifying and showing off what is going on, but then going on a bilateral basis or together with the sanctions coalition to those governments which might missed the cases or support such cases. And there are such jurisdictions that would rather turn a blind eye on what Russians are trying to do on their territory in circumventing sanctions. And the last point is, of course, the sanctions coalition partners, the governments, the capitals must make sure that whatever they decided on sanctions is being implemented. So this is not just a sixth package which has been agreed in Brussels, but important is that it is implemented by every single EU member state. So we will be working both from the multilateral, bilateral point of view, and then going identifying those trends and helping to the coalition to close those loopholes in the next sanctions packages.
All right, very good. Many thanks, Alexei. We are getting close to the end now, and we are running a bit over time. And I am very grateful for your patience. I know that Alex needed to go, and he has just left us. One more question for you, Natalia. I'm going to try to weave in different sort of questions that I've been receiving from different platforms that we have. Where we are broadcasting this particular event. So there's one question here which starts with, it asks, how can non-targeted sanctions against Russian citizens connected to Russia and Russian citizens and Russian citizens impact organizational capacities of Russian individuals in opposition to the regime living abroad. And I think here, making reference to a particular case of prohibition of using private jets, etc. But I think sort of the broader question that I see here, and I see in other questions that are coming, is basically when we try to understand sort of the opportunities to use economic tools in order to try to empower good forces or good activities in Russia that we hopefully could be working in opposition to the current regime. Is there something we need to think about then for how we use these economic tools? I mean, these are not sanctions policies more specifically, but I think they get down basically to the point of asking sort of, is there something we could do in order to help Russia stop this war by empowering the right forces inside Russia?
Thank you. So that's a very important question. And I have to tell you, when the war started and the efforts about sanctions were beginning, our major hypothesis was that we should put a lot of effort to make Russian citizens feel that Russia is doing something wrong by stimulating different actions to have like bank runs, increasing prices for some products, lack of imports of some basic stuff that everyone is buying. And we had a hope that if Russians in general feel, then they would see and oppose. And now I have no evidence that that's correct, because all the polls, both conducted by Russians themselves and also by Ukrainian groups who do different kind of like Viber or whatever surveys, they suggest that more than 80% of population support what Putin is doing. And some of the questionnaires, they suggest that more than 75% of population to different degree support use of nuclear weapon and support Russia going to other European countries to do whatever target they have. So, and when we observed that, we kind of lost hope that that should be the strategy, to target and try to make sure that regular Russians or whatever groups hear what we are doing and try to oppose. We don't see that it is possible. It doesn't fully answer to your question, because you're correct that there are some group of Russians like Navalny or somebody else, and that they are against Russia. And this question should be considered, but I don't think that it should be considered as a part of sanctions process. It should be considered as a part of, longer term strategy, how to reform Russia, because it's not a problem for 2 years. It's if we have such polls, it's this generational problem that people have such perspective in their head that they support killing innocent people and don't want to look into their window, and that kind of strategy and thinking should be happening. But I don't feel that this moment is now, because it all seems very marginal, but somebody should be, some process should be on that. I agree with that.
I think one can also make reference here. I mean, this debate came up in Europe also over the last couple of weeks when we were discussing the 6th sanctions package, which included broadcasting sanctions. So there has been one argument which has been saying that, no, we shouldn't have broadcasting sanctions because that means Russia is going to do the same to us. And then Russians will not be able to access European media that can tell a different story about the war, etc. But that seemed to me to be an extraordinarily naive and fanciful argument to make.
Yes, exactly. And there is evidence, like 3 months ago, Russia banned everything, every kind of even Russian media that could say something. So maybe we could hope for that 4 months ago, but not now.
Indeed.
By the way, Frederick, if you allow me short on that, on television, Russian television, this was, by the way, a very efficient way of uniting European countries against our idea, because we raised that question just about 1 month before the whole discussion on sixth package have started, and Minister Kuleba sent a letter to High Rep Borrell suggesting that actually those Russian-speaking channels, which are airing in the territory of European Union, are not just a propaganda channels, but is a source of internal instability. Because you might have noticed how many Russian-speaking Europeans, be they Russian citizens or Europeans of Russian descent, have been protesting on the street in support of Russia's war in Ukraine. So this was an issue of internal stability, and we put that argument at the table. On the table, and we appreciate that the European Union reacted in that way, stopping this propaganda and stopping Russians from using their fifth column, trying to blow up the democratic support inside European countries. So this was very, very important sanctions effort.
Indeed, very much so. All right, everyone, I am afraid we are going to have to stop there. I could definitely have continued for a long time more because I have several other questions that I wanted to ask, but that will have to be for another time because we are now 15 minutes past 4 o'clock. I would like to thank all the speakers so much, Alexei, Natalia, and of course Alex that has already left us. It's been an extraordinary pleasure for me to have this conversation with you, and I hope we can have one soon again, because the idea of a seventh package isn't entirely accepted in all parts of Europe. I think there is, as has been over a long period of time, there has been a support for the sanctions program. There is support for increasing